Good afternoon. Good afternoon. I'm Dave Vandermeer, Vice President of the Great Lakes PAM region, and we welcome you to the Schulmerich Handbell maintenance webinar today. With us is Bethan Neely, who is the repair and refurbishment coordinator for Schulmerich Handbells. So we welcome Bethan. If you have questions during the webinar, please either put them in the chat or the question and answers, and we'll field those questions as Bethan presents her session. Welcome, Bethan.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. So yes, I work for Schulmerich Bells. I have been here at Schulmerich for a little over 5 years now, working with repair and refurbishments, which sometimes is just single bells that get sent in for repairs. Sometimes it's full sets of bells that are being refurbished, and all kinds of other production related things at Schulmerich. So I've got here an example for you, a half bell, which is very convenient because you can see the inner mechanisms of the bell a lot easier than you can when you have a full handbell and you have to look inside. So this casting has been cut in half, and you can see the way the bell is assembled. We have the clapper head here. We've got our yoke assembly. So there's a shaft, the yoke block, which has an axle. There's an axle running through that yoke block, which lets the clapper shaft swing freely. This black piece is the restraining spring, the polyethylene spring. So as the spring hits against the two nuts on either side, that's what stops the clapper from just clanging around on the inside of the bell completely freely. It gives just the right amount of resistance so that the clapper rings the bell when you want it to ring, but it doesn't ring when you don't want it to ring. And so those two nuts are adjusted to the tension settings to allow the bell to ring that way. We also have, between the nuts and the spring, there's a small white anti-friction washer, as well as a small bumper. Both of those just allow for less wear and tear on the parts, and a little bit of a softer, more reliable attack from that nut versus if it was just the nut on the spring itself. Inside, it's a little bit hard to see, but there is a small spacer in between the yoke block and the casting. That means that the corners of the yoke block aren't resting directly on the casting, and so it allows the casting to resonate better. Otherwise, you would get a little bit of a buzzing sound where the vibrations of the casting would be hitting against that metal yoke block. And you can't see here, but you will see in a moment when I disassemble another bell that there's an index pin which runs all the way through the base of the yoke block, up through the casting, up through the handguard disc, and into the handle as well, which keeps everything in the bell aligned. And so that index pin allows the bell to hit at the strike point where the casting is tuned. Because of that index pin, it's not possible to assemble the bell to a different point. It's possible to assemble it backwards, but it can only be assembled along that 180 degrees because of the way that pin lines up with the parts. If the pin is broken or missing for some reason, then that changes things. But the purpose of that pin is to keep all of the parts aligned properly so that your clapper is hitting on the correct part of the casting and getting the best sound out of the bell. So I will go through now the example process of taking apart a bell for you so you can see that. I think I need to adjust just a little bit so you can see the table. There we go. So we have a few different tools that are used for working on the bells. The first one I'm going to be using is a ball hex driver. It's basically similar to an Allen key, but it's a different shape. So because of this shape, I'm able to put the ball hex driver in and rotate it at a slight angle as many times as I need to in the handle. Whereas if I was working with a normal angled Allen key, I would have to be constantly removing it from the screw and resetting it because I wouldn't be able to make full rotations. So I'm going to use the ball hex driver to remove the handle screw. There we go. And so now that the handle's out of the bell, you can see there's a screw. And when I push the screw out of the handle, you'll see there's also a small copper spacer as well. And so that spacer or lock washer just helps add a little bit of space in between the screw itself and the handle, just as a washer does. Typically, when we disassemble the bells, unless you're going to be replacing the screws or changing anything out with the screws, we recommend that you leave the screw and washer inside the handle so you don't lose them. If you take the screw and washer out, put them away, and then you go back to put the bell together at the end, the washer might have rolled away, the screw might have rolled away. So just to make sure you don't lose them, our typical practice is to leave them in place unless you're replacing them. So next we have the handguard disc. You'll see this is a C sharp or a D flat, and so it's labeled with both notes. If it was a natural note, it would just have the single note on it. And it has a small cavity in the base, which sits over the tang of the bell, and then it has this oval shaped opening, which allows for the screw in the center and then the pin on the side. So now we'll look at the casting, and you'll see there's the tang of the bell that I mentioned, this little round disc that comes up from the casting. And then the index pin as well. So that pin, there's actually a hole drilled through the casting, and then the pin is tapped into that hole. And that's what tunes the bell to the correct strike point. Over time, sometimes the best strike point on the bell will change. And so sometimes during refurbishments, we'll find that the strike point that was originally etched into the casting is no longer the best sounding spot on that casting. And so in that case, sometimes we can retune the bell. We'll go around it again, see if there's a spot that sounds a little bit better to us. And in that case, we would just tap out the index pin, drill a new hole for a new index pin at that new spot, and then put the pin in the new hole. Most of the time, bells stay where they are and the best spot stays the best spot. But every now and then, as the casting ages, as it wears over time, the sound quality attributes of that casting will just change with use. And so that is something that we have the ability to do here with refurbishments, is evaluate the casting and see if it's possible to be retuned. And you'll see as well that the pin does go all the way through to the inside of the casting as well. Something that we do here, which is, I believe, unique to Schulmerich bells, is that the outside of the bells are polished to a shinier jeweler's finish, but the inside stays unpolished. It's still clean, it's still freshly finished metal, but it's not polished to that same smooth finish. And that's because that allows us the flexibility to remove small amounts of material from the inside of the casting as needed to really fine tune the pitch of the bell. Whereas if we polished it to a fine finish on the inside, we wouldn't be able to make any adjustments at that point without having to go back and repolish the bell. So keeping it just a clean but unpolished raw finish on the inside allows us the ability to grind off very small amounts of material as needed. So here on the top of the yoke assembly, you'll see the spacer that I mentioned. For bells A4 and above, so the smaller bells, medium and small bells, we use these small metal zinc spacers. We use a plastic spacer for the larger base bells below that, just based on range for that difference. And again, the spacer is what allows the yoke and clapper assembly to rest just slightly above the casting rather than resting directly on the casting and muting the sound of the bell. And then here we have that yoke and clapper assembly, so you can see just a little bit more close up all the components. There's the yoke block, which is what everything rests in. We've got an axle and nyliners, nyliner bearings, which allow the axle to move freely inside that yoke block. We have two studs on either end of the block, which come out at an angle, and they have the small white anti-friction washers, the little black bumper, and the stop nut on them. And the stop nuts are adjusted to be tightened or loosened as needed so that the clapper moves the way you want it to, so that it's not too tight, not too loose, and the bells are just able to ring when you want them to, but not accidentally. These are select a strike clapper head, which means they're adjusted by using a screwdriver. So just a plain flathead screwdriver. You can loosen the clapper slightly and then rotate the clapper head. We have markings for soft, medium, and hard, S, M, and H. And by just loosening that screw slightly, you can rotate that clapper head to any of those desired settings and then tighten the screw again to lock it in place. The select a strike clapper heads also give you the flexibility, because it's just adjusted with a simple flathead screw, that you can set it, just slightly off of soft or just slightly off of medium or hard. We do not recommend setting it to the corners, so you can see that the metal clapper insert has points. We don't recommend setting it so that you're striking on the point, because that The metal being that much closer to the bell can cause cracked castings more often, but you do have flexibility if you want to put it slightly off of the letter indicated rather than directly on the letter, if that happens to balance better with your set of bells, because every casting is unique. And so every bell is a little bit different. You may need one bell to be set to soft and its neighboring bell to be set to medium in order to get a balanced sound across your set. And so that's one of the advantages of select to strike clappers, that it gives you that flexibility. A lot of times directors and teachers also prefer select to strike clappers because it gives a little bit more control to the director or the teacher in the room. Clappers that can be turned by hand between the two different settings, which we also offer as a secondary choice. We do have quick adjust clappers available, but then that gives the control of adjusting the bells over to the ringers as well. And especially with school teachers, we find if you're working with children, a lot of times those kids will just turn the clapper heads and click them to the different settings because they like to fidget. And so teachers will often say, I'd rather have the select to strike clappers, give me the screwdriver, my students can't adjust the bells. If we need to make an adjustment, then that is under the control of the teacher or director. But both styles of clappers really are great. It's just a matter of preference as far as the group you're working with. And we say, if you're working with a group of adults, if you know you can trust them, if it's a group where they're not going to be just sitting there fidgeting with the bells or changing clapper settings without checking with the director first, quick adjust clappers really are very convenient. If you like to adjust the clapper settings a lot to give you a different timbre and tone quality out of your bells, then the convenience of being able to do that without tools is definitely a useful thing. So we continue to offer both styles of clappers. Both are very popular, and it's really just a matter of preference. The quality is the same, the materials used are the same. The only difference is that adjustment method. So basic maintenance, as far as replacing parts, a lot of parts, some parts could be replaced without needing to disassemble the bells. For instance, if you wanted to put a new clapper head on, you could do that by just removing the screw while the bell is still fully assembled, putting the clapper head on again. That would be fine. Typically, the parts that you would want to replace the most often, which you would need to just disassemble the bell in order to do, would be the springs, anti-friction washers, and bumpers, and sometimes the stop nuts as well. Occasionally, the stop nuts will wear out and not have as much of a grip as they did when they were newer. But the spring is probably the most commonly replaced part because, like most other plastic and rubber parts, springs will crack over time. With age, with deterioration, with use and wear and storage conditions, all of those different factors. And so in order to replace the spring, once you have the bell disassembled like this, you would just remove the clapper head, remove the nuts, bumpers, and washers, and then you can just slide that spring off up the shaft of the clapper and put a new one in its place. Put the new washers, bumpers, and stop nuts on as well. Put the clapper head on, and then you're in business. So I won't demonstrate that full process, but it is pretty simple. You just take that screw out, remove those nuts. We have a nut driver tool, which is used for that. So you would just take the nut off with the nut driver. And that's the same tool you would also use to tighten or loosen the nuts as needed if you had a bell that was ringing a little bit too loosely for you or was ringing a little bit too difficult for you and needed to be loosened. So now we'll go through the process of putting the bell back together. So starting with the casting, you'll want to make sure you're putting it together the right direction. So like I said, that pin lets you put it together at a 180-degree line, but you want to make sure that the strike point is going to line up with the front of the bell at the end and not the back. So looking in the casting, it may be difficult to see. I'm not sure what the best angle for this camera is, but the strike point is right near where my finger is. And it can be faint. Like I said, it probably is a lot easier to see in person on your own bells than it is over the video chat. So when you get a chance, go look at the bells at your church and see if you can find those strike points. But the way I do things to reassemble the bell and make sure it stays lined up is I find that strike point and then turn the casting so that the strike point is facing away from me, the same way that it would be if you're ringing the bell. The strike point would be facing forward towards the congregation. And so the strike point when I put the bell together is going to be facing away from me as well. Then I'll take the handguard disc, put that back in place on top of the casting. I'll take the handle, and the handles are marked. So there's a bell insignia on the side that should be facing the ringer. And you'll see that same part of the handle is blank on the other side. So that tells the ringers what direction to hold the bell when they're ringing it. So again, if the strike point is facing away from me towards the congregation, then I'm going to want that bell symbol facing towards me when I put the bell back together. So I'll just set the handle down with the screw in place. At this point, the handle and handguard are in place. The screw is going through those parts into the bell casting, but it doesn't have anything on the other end of the screw. So now I'm going to take my non-dominant hand. So I am right-handed. I'm going to take my left hand, place my left index finger on top of the screw, just holding it in place there, and grip the casting with my thumb and other fingers. So that allows me to flip it over, keeping everything assembled. So I'll do that one more time. And again, I'm using my non-dominant hand for this part. That's because later I'll be using tools with my other hand. And so it's easier for me to use those tools with my right hand. Someone who's left-handed would probably want to do this step using their right hand so that they're then using the tools with their left hand. So I'm taking my index finger, placing that on the screw in the handle, holding that down and in place with just a little bit of pressure, and then gripping the casting with the rest of my hand, which allows me to hold these parts in place as I flip the casting over. So you'll see at this point that screw isn't holding on to anything. So I'll need to take my spacer, place the spacer on the screw inside the bell. That's a very important step. Make sure not to forget your spacer. Otherwise, the yoke assembly and casting will be resting directly against each other, which damps the sound of the bell. So then at this point, I'll be putting the yoke assembly in place. You can see in the base of that yoke block, there's two holes. The larger hole is for the screw and the smaller hole is for the pin. And you can see there's a small ring around that hole as well, which is the circle created by that pin. So I'm going to be holding the casting in place. I'm going to get the yoke block so that it's resting with the screw hole on the screw. And then I'm going to start screwing it into place. And as it gets closer, I'll start to feel the pin begin to scrape against the bottom of that yoke block. And I'll keep going until I feel the pin slide into place on that hole. So here I can't really turn the part anymore. The yoke block is in place. The pin is in its hole. It's still a little bit loose. The screw isn't tightened all the way. So what I'll do now is I'll hold the yoke in place, lined up with the pin. I'll take my ball hex driver and I'll use that to tighten the screw the rest of the way. At this point, I'm going to stop when I feel it get a little bit of resistance, but I'm not going to tighten it fully because that pin helps everything line up, but it's not exact. And so you'll see the bell's a little bit crooked right now. It might be hard to tell on the video, but the C# notes are not lining up exactly with each other. The handle's just a little bit crooked. So at this point, I'll go in by hand. I'll make sure that the clapper is really straight on that strike point. I'll make sure that the handle is really lined up straight with the clapper. I'll make sure that the disc is rotated just a little bit so that everything's lined up nicely as well. And once I have everything lined up, then I'll go in with the ball hex driver again and just give it an extra couple twists so that it's really secure. So now our bell is back together. Everything's lined up nice and straight. And I'll just need to make sure that the stop nut settings are still correct. So I can use my nut driver. And as I ring the bell, if I think that's ringing a little bit too loosely for me, the nuts are the opposite. So if you look at the way the bell moves inside, if I adjust the nut on the opposite side of the strike point, if I loosen that nut, that will allow the clapper to move further towards the strike point. So if it's ringing a little bit too loose for me, I want to tighten the nut on the opposite side of the strike point. So I gave it a few turns too tight. Now it's a little bit tighter than I want. It's not ringing quite as easily as I'd like. So again, I'll just loosen it slightly until it gets to the point where I want it to. If I find I'm getting a lot of back ring from the bell, if I'm ringing it and as I go to damp, it's double ringing when I move the bell backwards, that means I need to adjust the front nut because that means that that front nut is too loose and it's allowing the clapper to swing too far towards the back of the bell. So if you're getting too much back ringing, you want to tighten that front nut a little bit and you can just turn the bell the other direction to test that. You really shouldn't be able to ring the bell backwards without putting a lot of effort into it. That also is a deterrent for your ringers. That way they'll realize quicker if they're ringing their bells backwards. If it's hard to ring them, they'll look at it and go, oh, hang on a second, that's backwards. Whereas if it's easy to ring them backwards, then they may not notice until the rehearsal's over that they had their bell the wrong direction. You do want a little bit of back ring, because if you're going to be doing a shake, you need the casting to be able to ring with the clapper on both sides. So if I'm adjusting the back ring, once I get it so it's difficult to ring backwards, I'll also do a shake and just make sure I can execute that right. If the shake seems like it's too difficult and it's not really hitting against both sides of the casting, then I'll loosen that front nut again, just a little bit, until it shakes nicely for me. So right now this clapper is set on soft, and I'm not sure how well this comes across through speakers on Zoom, but at least to me, it does have a slightly more muted timbre compared to the other settings. So I'm just going to change it to medium for comparison. So what you heard before was soft. This is medium. And again, I know we're on Zoom right now, but you should be able to hear a little bit more of a slightly more percussive tone out of the bell on medium. And then on hard, it should be, again, a much brighter tone compared to medium and very much compared to soft. So this is hard. And I haven't changed the way I'm ringing the bell. I'm using the exact same amount of force, the exact same amount of movement. That's just the clapper difference. And if you look at the clapper, you'll see the soft setting has a slot. There's really a very small amount of rubber there. The medium setting has just a small hole in the rubber. And then the hard setting is completely solid. So it's just the density of the material there. Dynamics are not controlled by the clapper setting. You can ring based on the amount of energy that you use in your arm. You can ring at any dynamics within the same clapper settings. It really is more of a timbre difference, that hard is going to be a much brighter tone, soft is going to be more muted, medium is going to be somewhere in the middle. A lot of times you may change your clapper settings based on the room that you're ringing in. If you're ringing in a very vibrant, echoey space, you might need them to be on hard to really cut through that acoustic. If you're ringing in a space where it's very easy to hear everything and it's very crisp and clear, and you need less tone, less overtone, less brightness out of the bells, you might want to use a softer setting. You might change the clapper settings depending on the piece of music you're playing. If you're playing a softer, more reflective song, you might want all of the bells to have a softer, more reflective tone. Most of the time, they're going to be set on medium. Like I said, there's certain castings that you may need to set on hard or soft to balance with their neighbors. There may be occasions when you want to change your clapper settings, but for the most part, medium is going to be where you start. So that's the majority of things that you might need to think about as far as replacing parts, adjusting parts on your bells. Because of the vibrations of the bells, things like screws, the handle screws, the clapper screws, the stop nuts will need to be tightened and adjusted every now and then. That's just a part of ongoing maintenance with your bells. And so the three main tools you would use for that are the ball hex driver, which is for the handle screw, the regular flathead screwdriver for your clapper heads. If you have quick adjust clapper head, you might use an Allen key for that. But for standard selector strike clapper heads, it would be this screwdriver. And then the nut driver for the stop nuts on the inside of the bells. And we do have a few different size nut drivers depending on the range of the bells. This one covers the majority of the bells. This covers from G3 to B5, so a pretty wide range there, a little over 2 octaves. And then there's a smaller one for C6 up to C8, as well as a larger one for F#3 and below. And this is probably the most common adjustment as far as just getting your bells to ring the way you want them to. Just getting those stop nuts to the point where it's the Goldilocks setting, not too tight, not too loose, but just right. As far as other maintenance things that you would do for your bells, you'll want to polish them on a semi-regular basis. Polishing the bells doesn't change the sound of the bell. The castings, unless it's an extreme setting, really aren't going to be damaged by a little bit of tarnish. Obviously, if your bells have gone through more severe damage, something like flooding or water damage, anything like that, that's a different situation. A little bit of tarnish doesn't hurt the bells, but it is something that builds up with time. And so if you don't polish your bells regularly, they become more and more tarnished. It becomes a lot harder to polish them. So it's the kind of thing where if you just do it regularly, it's a lot easier of a job. Most people we recommend, and most groups do this, will polish their bells just with regular cloths on a more frequent basis, maybe once a week, maybe once a month or so, depending on how they're used. But then you'll do a more in-depth polishing with polishing paste, maybe once a year. And that would be a good, you get your group together at the end of the season for a polishing party, or at the beginning of the season for a polishing party. And you just go over them and use that polishing paste to get off any fingerprints, any smudges, any tarnish, anything that might be there. I mentioned about exposure to flooding or moisture, anything like that. Something to keep in mind for that as well is humidity, because humidity can also cause tarnish on the bells. We typically recommend keeping your bells in a climate controlled environment. Where you guys are in the Great Lakes region, you get some humidity. It's not quite as bad as, we'll deal with people down south where they have a whole lot of humidity, places like Florida, Louisiana. So it's a little bit harder on them to keep things in a climate controlled environment, but we do recommend trying to keep your bells out of high humidity levels. And that's hard on the parts as well, not just the castings, but parts like the springs and clappers, those rubber parts will wear out faster when they're exposed to humidity. So that's a general recommendation for storage conditions, just trying to avoid moisture and humidity as that damages the castings and damages the parts of the bells. For polishing, we also, because the inside of the bells are not a smooth polished finish, we do not, it's not even a matter of not recommending, but you really should not use polish on the inside of the bells, because any of that chemical polish can get trapped in the small ridges of the casting, and then that will continue to eat away at the metal if it's left for a long period of time. So do not use polish on the inside of the castings. The only things you should use to clean the inside of the castings are clean, dry cloths, or anything that's, again, clean and dry, no moisture, no chemicals, no soaps, no polishes, no solvents like that, because anything that gets trapped in those fine ridges will eat away at the casting and can cause permanent damage. Polishing paste should be used just on the outside on that smooth, shiny jeweler's finish, and then rubbed off when it's dry with just a regular soft cloth, something that's not going to scratch the castings. All right, well, normally when I teach this, we get a whole lot of questions, and I'm realizing now that this presentation was pretty much all straight through without a lot of questions. So are there any questions we can field now?
So I have one, Bethan.
Yes.
So on the yoke assembly where the axle, the pin, with the, sometimes I've noticed with Schulmerich bells that they don't pivot as well. And it gets stuck. Is there a way to adjust that pin?
So it's not the pin that's adjusted, but yes, there's two things that it could be. Typically, what we do first to check that adjustment is actually to spread the yoke block itself slightly. And the yoke block, sometimes it just constricts with time. Sometimes it constricts if that handle screw is too tight. That applies too much pressure to that yoke block, and it causes the side walls. It's a little hard to see here, but it can cause those two side walls on either side of the spring to actually constrict and apply too much pressure on the axle and the spring. And so just as a first easier step, it doesn't always fix the problem, but you can try just ever so slightly loosening the handle screw. You don't want to loosen it too much, because that will then obviously have your bell no longer be snug and secure. The screw should still be tight enough that it's holding everything in place. But sometimes just a quarter turn or so just takes a little bit of pressure off of that yoke block and allows the pin to move more freely. The other step is to use what we call a yoke spreader tool. It's basically like a reverse pliers. So it's something that it has two prongs. It goes in either side of that yoke block. You can slide it in right underneath the spring and apply just a small amount of pressure outwards, which can spread those walls just a little bit and take some of that pressure off of the axle pin. Occasionally, we do also need to change out the 9-liner bearings, that little white plastic part. We actually now, that part is now gray, but it's the same purpose. If you get new bells or new repaired parts from the factory, they will have gray 9-liner bearings there. And occasionally as the bearings wear out, they will need to get changed. But most of the time, it's the parts themselves, that's the block itself, that's the problem.
And then that tool is available? for
Yes,
people
it
to
is.
purchase? Yes.
It's
Great.
available from us. That's also something that we can do as a repair here. A lot of times people might not feel comfortable doing that repair themselves. The tool is available and we're happy to guide you through it. But if it's something that you aren't a little bit nervous about and don't quite feel comfortable with, that's something where you're certainly welcome to send that bell into the factory. And depending on how busy we are, usually it's a pretty quick turnaround to just adjust that and get it sent back out to you.
Do other people have any questions? Seeing none.
I've gone ahead and opened up Robin and Sandra's ability just to freely ask questions versus typing in the Q&A or the chat.
Thank you, Kelly. Robin or Sandra, any questions?
I don't think so, not specific questions, but if I watched this and missed a part of it or I'm not sure I remember exactly, is there another way to access? Is there a written online directions or a video or anything like that?
Are you talking about a resource through Schulmerich or a resource through the Great Lakes PAM?
No, I'm talking about a resource through Schulmerich. Is
Okay.
there, do you have online manual or something I could refer to be sure I remembered what you said?
Yes, I just wanted to make sure I wasn't stepping on any toes before I answered that from the Schulmerich side of things. But yes, we have a series of maintenance videos that are available on YouTube. Kelly just sent a message here that this forum, my presentation is recorded, so you can watch this over again if you need to. There's, like I said, some videos on YouTube that Schulmerich put together several years ago covering basic maintenance tips. And we do also have a maintenance manual available as well, which has very detailed written guidelines on all of the different parts of the bells, different possible issues that could come up with them, basically how to go through any repair that might be needed.
Thank you.
If we don't have any other questions for right now, at least on the bells, I can also do a quick review of chimes. Chimes are a lot simpler than bells, so it should be quicker,
Sure.
but I'd be happy to do that as well. If you give me just a second to grab a chime, I don't think I have one in this room with me, but I will be right back. All right, so we've got some chimes here as well. Like I said, chimes are a simpler construction than the bells. So I have two to demonstrate. I have a B4 chime, and I picked the two ranges because our lowest chimes have yarn clapper heads. I also have a G#5 chime because the higher chimes have rubber clapper heads. And the rubber clapper head has settings similarly to the bells for Well, similar to soft, medium, and soft, but there's actually 6 different clapper settings on the chimes. So you can see because of the way the chime rings, it doesn't have to have the same setting at the 180-degree points. Because of the way the bell clapper can hit either side of the casting, soft has to be the same on both sides. Because the chime clapper only hits in one direction, that allows us to have 6 different settings. And so you can see, hopefully you can see, there we go, that looks like a better angle. That there are 6 distinct different settings for the density of the rubber on that clapper head. And so you would just need to slightly loosen that nut. It's a nut driver tool similar to the one used on the bells, but a different size that would allow you to just loosen that nut a little bit and then rotate that clapper head to a different point and tighten it down. So that's going to be on the chimes for C#5 and above that you'll find you have those rubber clapper heads. Below from C5 on down, you'll have on the newer chimes yarn clapper heads. On the older chimes, it would be felt clapper heads, but it would be the same thing. They can't be adjusted to different hardness settings. As far as the ringing action of the chimes, there's 2 things that are adjusted. The most common is this little bumper. So the bumper at the base of the clapper shaft is what keeps the chime from resting directly on the clapper. That raises the clapper up so that when I move it like this, the clapper head doesn't touch the chime. When I ring it with a little bit more force, the clapper head does touch the chime. And if you can see, the bumper it has a hole in the center around that shaft, and the hole is not in the center. So depending on how I rotate the bumper, I can move it so that the clapper really is basically resting against the chime. Or I can move it so that the clapper is very far away from the chime. So at this point, there's so much resistance that you really can't get the chime to ring at all. If I go the other direction, the chime's going to ring too easily. So similarly to adjusting the stop nuts on the bells, you want to just kind of turn the bumper and practice ringing it until it seems like it's where you want it to be. The bumper should only be rotated to do the adjustment. It shouldn't be moved up and down the clapper shaft. Sometimes people will be under the impression that the bumper needs to slide up and down in order to adjust it. And actually it's hard to tell, but you should be able to see there's a small, there's a round spot, a special notch where the bumper is supposed to rest. And then above that notch, there's a hexagon shaped shaft. So the bumper really has a spot where it's supposed to stay. It shouldn't be moved up and down. If you slide it up and down, then the center of that bumper will become too loose and worn out and it won't have any grip anymore. So it's not going to stay in place properly. So do make sure that that stays in its proper spot, and then you can rotate it as needed to adjust the chime. The other spot that can be adjusted on the chimes is, you hopefully can see at the base of the yoke mount here, there's 2 very small set screws, which are adjusted with a very small hex driver again. And the set screws control the tension on the axle of the chime. And so we adjust them to the point where if you raise the clapper up, it falls freely, but it only just falls freely. So we'll tighten them to the point where it doesn't move freely, and then we'll loosen them just to the point where it will fall, because if it's too loose, then it kind of rattles back and forth and you get a little bit too much wiggle action in the clapper movement. So those are the main adjustments there. And again, with the lower chimes, that yarn head or felt head, if it's an older chime, just gives a little bit more softness to the tone. But the trade-off on that is you don't really have a hardness setting. There's just one setting as far as the sound of the chime. Over time, you may notice that the yarn head or the felt head start to develop flat spots because you're striking on that soft clapper head at the same spot. And so you can use the same nut driver that you would use to adjust the smaller chime clapper settings to just rotate that yarn head or felt head to another spot that's not flat, that's going to have a little bit more rebound, a little bit more mellowness, a little bit more cushioniness to it than that older spot that might get worn out over time. Chimes are a lot easier than the bells in that they don't need to be polished. If they start to get dirty or sticky or anything like that, they should be wiped down But otherwise, they don't need to be maintained the same way as the bells as far as keeping them polished and shiny, because they are just a basic painted surface. They're not going to show fingerprints as easily as a polished bell casting. They're unlikely to get the same type of wear as far as tarnish or anything like that. So it's really just a matter of keeping them clean. And you don't need to worry as much about what you use to clean the chimes, because again, it's not that same polished finish. It's not as touchy as the bells. So, I mean, even during COVID, we were telling people it's okay to wipe the chimes down with Clorox wipes if you need to disinfect them. We wouldn't recommend letting them sit in a strong disinfectant for a long period of time because that will damage them, but just a quick wipe down is fine. And just try to avoid, getting those chemicals on the yarn or felt, because that more fabric material, it's obviously not good for it to be soaked in disinfectant. But the chimes themselves are a lot easier, certainly easier to maintain than the bells. There's less moving parts. There's less parts that can go wrong. There's less components in general that could need to be replaced. They're just a lot simpler instruments. Of course, one of the downsides to that is that one of the most common issues people run into with chimes is that they're cracked. And unfortunately, if a chime is cracked, it can't be repaired. It has to be replaced. Chimes can crack because they're hit against the edge of a table, because they're struck against the edge of a case or another chime or a music stand, or even just from ringing them too hard. Sometimes you find people who they wail on their chimes like it's a baseball bat, not a musical instrument. And so that can cause the chimes to crack as well if they're just being rung with too much force. And so unfortunately, like I said, because of the way that the nature of the instrument is, once the aluminum tubing that makes up the chime is cracked, it can't be repaired. It has to be replaced. And the unfortunate thing too is that it's not always possible to see those cracks because they can be microscopic. So you might not realize your chime is cracked, but you might think it's gone out of tune, or it's developed a buzzing sound, or it just isn't as resonant as it used to be. And those are all signs of a crack. Unfortunately, even if you can't see it crack, it does mean that the chime will have to be replaced. So simpler instruments, less touchy than the bells. They don't need quite as much maintenance, but they do need to be treated with care because through mishandling, they can be damaged and then they need to be replaced. Any questions about chimes?
That's great. Don't see any. Well, I'd like to thank Bethan for sharing today her presentation on handbell maintenance and hand chime maintenance with us. Thank you for your time. We will be hosting in 2 weeks on March 22nd. Wendy Ransom will be giving us advanced handbell techniques for the Great Lakes PAM region. So we invite you back at 1 o'clock on March 22nd at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you all for being here today. And if you have any questions for the Great Lakes PAM board, please let us know. Our website or our email addresses are on our website, on the PAM website. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you again, Bethan.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Good day, everyone.